Hello and welcome back to Oxygen Not Included. The big news from this weekend is that heat deletion options are being removed from the game. Fixed output temperatures are a thing of the past. Nowadays, if you put in 70-degree water into your water sieve, you're going to get 70-degree water out. 70-degree polluted water in, 70-degree water out. No longer is it going to output at a fixed 40 degrees. Same thing for the carbon skimmer. If you put in 80-degree water in, you're going to get 80-degree polluted water out. It's a little bit different for the electrolyzer. If you put in 40-degree water into your electrolyzer, you're going to get 70-degree oxygen and hydrogen out. But if you put in 90-degree water in, you're going to get 90-degree oxygen and hydrogen out. So there's a minimum temperature for the electrolyzer now, but there is no deletion of heat using any of these options anymore. Because either the output temperature is going to be exactly the same as the input temperature, or there's just only a minimum output temperature and no maximum output temperature. So this is a major change to the game because these buildings for the longest time have been the backbone of heat management in the game. These buildings have been the primary way that most experienced players have dealt with heat. In particular, the water sieve and the carbon skimmer have been huge because players will take polluted water, heat it up to 110 degrees, run it through the water sieve, get 40-degree water out, take that water, heat that up to 90 degrees, run it through a carbon skimmer, get 40-degree polluted water out, and then heat that back up to 110 degrees, run it back through the water sieve, and so on and so forth. And it only consumed sand and carbon dioxide, which are two resources you really didn't care about. In particular, some people just use the water sieve. They did a once-through pass. They used the water then to put it into an electrolyzer or some other thing. And only used sand, which is something that you have a ton of in every map. So for the longest time, we've been using and abusing these heat deletion options as sort of the backbone of heat management in the game, and now they are gone. Clay has decided we don't want these things in the game, and I think this is a great change. I think that a lot of people are upset for now because a lot of their bases don't work anymore, but I think in the long run this is going to be really positive because for one, a lot of players just fundamentally didn't like the idea of heat deletion. They didn't like the physics being broken so easily and so readily in the form of these buildings. And so they literally, you'd see comments in the forum saying, I like the game, but I'm just not going to play it while heat deletion is still a thing. Now that heat deletion is no longer a thing, now that fixed output temperatures are a thing of the past, welcome back to these new players. For newer players, I think this is also going to be a positive change because the water sieve and the carbon skimmer were sort of traps for them before. They didn't understand that the temperatures would be output at a fixed temperature of 40 degrees, and so inadvertently a lot of newer players would cook their early game bases just by trying to remove CO2 from the air and cleaning up their polluted water. This is really rough for them, right? They didn't understand this was going to happen. It was really non-intuitive that this was going to happen, and their best ways of dealing with the heat problem once they had created it, they didn't realize were in using these buildings, right? They'd go to something like utilities and say, how can I cool down my base? Because that's what it says, heat up and cool down, right? But they didn't realize that the best heat management options in the game were in fact located under oxygen and refinement. So that's a really non-intuitive thing that caught a lot of newer players and made the game very difficult for them. And so I think this is going to be an improvement for new players as well. And I think it's also going to be an improvement for veteran players because while it makes the game more intuitive and a little bit easier in the early game because these buildings are not going to heat up your base, it makes the game much harder in the late game and really challenges a lot of older, more veteran players to come up with new solutions to heat. In particular, for a long time, we didn't even care what the heat generation rate of a building was. If it produces 1 kilodtu per second, 2 kilodtus per second, 4 kilodtus per second, 10 kilodtus per second. We didn't care. It didn't matter. I mean, maybe we need to put a little bit of cooling in whatever room the building was in, but in the big scale, long-term thing, we didn't care about how much heat these buildings generated because we expected we'd be able to delete all of it anyways. If heat got bad, we'd just set up one of these water sieve carbon skimmer loops and delete all the heat from our base. We could freeze the entire map if we wanted to. These options were so powerful. Now, we actually need to consider and think, is this building worth the heat that it's going to create? How much cooling do I need to provide to my base, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Now it's a challenge. And I think the return of challenge and making the game harder is going to be something that a lot of older players are going to enjoy. There's some controversy as to whether or not this will actually lead to more diversity in the builds. Certainly, water sieves and carbon skimmers were two of the most important buildings, but they have left up one of the other big three options, which is the steam turbine. And so a lot of people theorize that the steam turbine is what everyone's going to use for all of their heat deletion options or heat management options. And I just kind of want to go over today, and this is going to be the topic of the video, I want to go over today what are our options for heat management going forward in Oxygen Not Included now that these buildings no longer work the way that they used to work, now that they're a little bit more in line with what physics actually is. So let's scroll out here a little bit. Here on the right, I have a bunch of sort of normal buildings that generate heat. Up here we have buildings that don't generate heat, surprisingly enough. I did not even realize this. This is how little we cared about heat generation in the days of yore. But here we have buildings that generate 500 DTUs per second, buildings that generate about 1 to 1.5 kilodtus per second, 2 kilodtus per second, 4 kilodtus per second, 9 to 10 kilodtus per second, around 20 kilodtus per second, and then the Polymer Press, which is in a class sort of its own. This outputs a whopping 32.5 kilodtus per second. So these are a lot of the buildings that you'll build and how much heat roughly they generate. In the middle here I have how much water could absorb that heat. If this water raised its temperature by 10 degrees and you left these buildings on for an entire cycle, right? How much water would you need to absorb that heat? Or to put another way of talking about it, if you left these buildings on for an entire cycle, 600 seconds, right? How much water would they be able to heat up by 10 degrees, right? Is what this represents down here. So here we've got about 14 kilograms spread out across here. Over here we've got about 3 times that, right? Over here we've got 12 times that, right? We've got about 17 kilograms per tile over here, whereas this is, 1.4 kilograms per tile over here. These are all 10 tiles wide, just to give a rough idea. So we're going to have sort of a visual representation of how much heat we're talking about. And on the left-hand side, I have cooling options that are roughly equivalent to these things right here, right? So we have our range of heat-producing stuff. We have our cooling options over here, and we're going to go over our cooling options in the video right now. So first up, carbon dioxide geysers. You're going to find some of these things lying around the map. They don't produce much cooling at all because the outputs don't have very high thermal mass. This one is emitting 45.1 grams per second. I don't remember what the average one will do, but if you took the average carbon dioxide geyser, which outputs negative 55 degree carbon dioxide, and took that carbon dioxide and heated it up to 72 degrees before presumably feeding it to a slickster or something like that, that would provide enough cooling over the average lifespan, right? Over the average cycle of dormancy and active periods and so on and so forth. That would provide enough cooling to basically cool down 14 kilograms of water per day by 10 degrees, right? Not much in the grand scheme of things. Also on this same tier is a single Pacu. Pacu, for those of you who are in the know, have a very high specific heat capacity and a fixed temperature at which they are born or generated, right? So it's 200 kilograms of genetic ooze, which has a specific heat capacity of 3.47, very high, much better than the carbon dioxide, which was 0.846, right? So these Pacu are fairly massive, 200 kilograms. Better than that, they have 2 different life cycle stages, one at which they are young Pacu or Pacu fry, basically, and they have 200 kilograms of mass there as well. And they have 200 kilograms of mass as sort of a normal Pacu, right? And this is with a really high specific heat capacity. And they have a fairly short lifespan. Over the course of 25 cycles, they will live and die. And with 5 more cycles, they will have an egg incubation period, right? So it takes 5 cycles for the egg to incubate. So over the course of 30 total cycles, a Pacu will live, generate another Pacu, and die. And it will twice over the course of that lifespan generate 200 kilograms of 3.47 specific heat capacity mass, right? So 400 kilograms of that 3.47 kilogram mass every 30 cycles. And Pacu are generated at fixed temperatures. A normal Pacu is produced at 30 degrees Celsius, a tropical Pacu at 55 degrees Celsius, and a gulpfish at negative 12.5 degrees Celsius. So assuming we have a very just conservative estimate for how much the heat these Pacu end up absorbing, right? And I'm saying that they absorb 13 degrees Celsius. They absorb enough to increase their temperature by 13 degrees Celsius over their lifespan. Assuming just a very mild increase in temperature to the Pacu, that is enough. A single Pacu will generate the same amount of cooling as an entire carbon dioxide geyser. And of course, if you took, say, tropical Pacu, which are born at 55 degrees, and threw them in a pool of, say, 95 degree water, maybe sort of a condensing pool for a cool steam vent, you're going to get more than just a 13 degree change, right? You're going to get a 40 degree change, roughly 3 times as much. So a tropical Pacu in a cool steam vent pool will basically generate 3,000 DTUs per second worth of cooling just by living, dying, and absorbing during its lifespan some of that heat with its fixed temperature. There are a lot of builds I could show off with Pacu. In particular, the cooling options that you have with them, sort of heat-controlled tanks, how you'd set it up, and how many Pacu you'd want to put into a cool steam vent. But I'm not really going to go over a lot of the Pacu ranching stuff because I think that a lot of other YouTubers have done that sort of already. Brothgar in particular has a great set of videos looking at Pacu ranching and how it's very easy to set up. There are guides out there, but basically it's really easy to generate Pacu, and a single Pacu generates a lot of cooling for you. Every single one of these Pacu very easily can counterbalance the heat generated by any one of these buildings over here, right? With a very easy setup, this should be possible. So Pacu are one of your early options as well as these carbon dioxide geysers. Moving down, we have wild Wheezeworts. Wheezeworts were nerfed, so now when they are in their wild form, they only produce 1/4 of the cooling that they did before, and you need to fertilize them and do stuff with them to get sort of the full output that you had before. However, Wheezeworts are still a pretty good option. I haven't run the exact numbers, so this could be off by a little bit. But before, Wheezeworts provided 12,000 DTUs per second of cooling if you immerse them in hydrogen. So a wild Wheezewort producing 1/4 of that, assuming they get sort of the stuff right. These things are a little bit bugged at the moment, so we're not testing them. But it's possible they wanted to change the numbers as well. But in any case, assuming 12,000 DTUs per second is the intended number for a Wheezewort, a wild Wheezewort will produce 3,000 DTUs per second of cooling, which is going to be basically just 3 times the amount of water that we had up here. Right now we're getting into the territory of 43 kilograms per day of water cooled down by 10 degrees. If we go down a little bit further, we get sort of tamed or domesticated Wheezeworts, right? These are going to produce their full output. A single Wheezewort will produce 12,000 DTUs per second. So one Wheezewort is enough to cool down 172 kilograms of water by 10 degrees every cycle. Moving down a little bit further, we have the Ice Maker. The Ice Maker was nerfed, so it's about 1/5 as effective as before. It was nerfed in a pretty nice way, though, which means that it's not going to require any more duplicate labor than before. So duplicants are going to sort of go and fill up an Ice Maker a lot less frequently now. But the Ice Maker is just going to operate basically at 1/5 of the speed that it did before. So it's only going to delete, instead of basically the full amount of heat from the water, which ended up being around 100,000 DTUs per second per Ice Maker, now it's going to be about 1/5 of that, so 20,000 DTUs per second. So one Ice Maker can basically counteract a kiln or counteract a petroleum generator, or, I mean, I don't know why you'd be doing this, but could counteract roughly a space heater. So here we have 287 kilograms of water. This is how much you can cool down by 10 degrees every cycle using an Ice Maker. And I've got a great video on how to use the Ice Maker, how to set it up so that you're actually getting sort of the cold out of it and not just generating an ever-increasing pile of ice. But the Ice Maker, definitely a powerful structure that we're going to be using a lot more for our early game and mid-game cooling. Next up, you might be surprised to see this, but Hydrogen Generator is one of the buildings that you can use to cool your base. I know that's a little bit counterintuitive because I think I have the Hydrogen Generator, up here in the 4 kilodtu heating section. But the thing about the Hydrogen Generator is it deletes the hydrogen that you pump into it. So if you have a steel hydrogen generator and it consumes 100 grams per second of hydrogen, which has a fairly high specific heat capacity of 2.4 DTUs per gram per degree Celsius, if you heated up that hydrogen from, say, the 70 degrees that it starts at from an electrolyzer to, say, 250 degrees, if you heated it up by 180 degrees Celsius before running it through a hydrogen generator, you would get 43,200 DTUs of cooling effectively, because you'd just be dumping your heat into the hydrogen and then deleting the hydrogen. So heat deletion still exists. It just exists in a slightly different form. This is still a very powerful building. I think a lot of electrolyzer builds now, because electrolyzers are going to be something that are kind of core to your heat management problems, a lot of your electrolyzer buildings right now, I think, are going to be using hot hydrogen. They're going to heat up the hydrogen that comes out of it and pump it into these hydrogen generators to delete that heat and have a sort of self-sufficient heat solution and power solution for their electrolyzers. Speaking of electrolyzers, though, the electrolyzer is still a building that can delete heat for you, because the thing is, water has a specific heat capacity of 4.179, very high, which is why these quantities have been relatively little. But oxygen, which is the main thing that the hydrogen generator, or not the hydrogen generator, the electrolyzer produces, has a specific heat capacity of roughly 1. So, what if we took water that was at 70 degrees and heated it up to 95 degrees before putting it through this electrolyzer, and then took the resulting oxygen and hydrogen at 95 degrees and cooled both of those down to 70 degrees, what we would have gotten if we had just run the 70 degree water through the electrolyzer. With this very basic preheating setup for an electrolyzer, you can get a pretty good amount of cooling. By my estimate, 75,555 DTUs per second, right? Which is enough to basically cool down at least a couple of these polymer presses, basically 2 1/3, right? Now we're getting into some fairly appreciable amounts of water here. This is, what is this? This is 1,084 kilograms of water that I've put down here. Just with a very basic preheating system, taking your water that you had at 70 degrees, dumping 25 degrees, roughly speaking, worth of heat into it, running it through the electrolyzer, and then cooling down, paying the cost to cool down the resulting outputs, you generate a very large amount of cooling. Next up, I have what would basically be a thermonullifier. Thermonullifier, I don't have debug mode on, so I don't have this down here. It's just going to be, except that in this blank tile, I would put a thermonullifier. Thermonullifiers, if you feed them hydrogen, and not much, 10 grams per second basically, will produce 80,000 DTUs of cooling every second. So a little bit more water than what we had up here. This was 1,084 kilograms of water per day. You could cool down by 10 degrees. Here we have 1,148 kilograms of water you could cool down. Moving down a little bit further here, the hydrogen generator returns. This is still another option that we have, only now we've made it out of thermium. So instead of heating up our hydrogen from 70 degrees to 250 degrees before we delete it through the hydrogen generator, what if we made all of our components out of thermium, that we were able to heat everything up even further? If instead of heating it up by 180 degrees, we heated it up by 830 degrees Celsius, well, we get a lot more out, right? Here I have 2,860 kilograms of water in this little area right here. This is how much water you could cool down with thermium components and the same sort of heat deletion that we used with this hydrogen generator idea over here. Next, a building that's going to surprise you a little bit, we have the rock granulator. And this rock granulator is going to function very similar to how this electrolyzer build functions, which is that we can take this rock granulator and turn obsidian, which has a specific heat capacity of 0.2, we can take that obsidian and turn it into sand at a 1-to-1 ratio. And the sand has a specific heat capacity of 0.83. And so if we cool down our obsidian to say negative 200 degrees Celsius, then convert that into sand, and so we get negative 200 degrees Celsius sand out of the rock granulator, we can use that extra thermal mass, that extra cold thermal mass, to cool stuff down. And so if we cooled obsidian from 30 degrees down to negative 200 degrees, but then turned it into sand and heated up the sand from negative 200 degrees to 30 degrees, we would get enough cooling to cool down 5,200 kilograms of water. Quite a bit. And I can, in later videos, I can maybe show you a setup for how you would do that, how you would set this up so that you can cool down your obsidian and warm up your sand. But this is actually something that doesn't even require any thermium, because we're not really interested in superheating our sand or finding super hot obsidian to work with. We're really just finding normal temperature stuff and just cooling down the inputs before we turn them into higher specific heat capacity outputs. So the rock granulator, a surprising way of cooling down your base. Next up, we have what would be a cool slush geyser. The average cool slush geyser is going to produce enough cooling if you heated its products, if you heated its outputs up to around 25 degrees Celsius, you would get roughly 400,000 DTUs per second of cooling. And that's going to equal, I believe this is 5,775 kilograms of water that we have lying here in this basin. Cool slush geysers are still going to be an extremely powerful option for cooling down your base. This is just heating up that water to 25 degrees, sort of a room temperature sort of thing. You could, of course, heat it up even further and have it used in one of these sort of setups that we have over here. But cool slush geysers are going to be a major boon. I mean, if we look at it, they're all the way down here. This is way, way down. We're talking 400,000 DTUs per second. That's 400 of any one of these buildings, basically, roughly speaking. Some of these are a little bit more than 1 kilo DTU. That's 800 refrigerators, 800 ceiling lights that you could cool down using just a single cool slush geyser. Not pictured, but imagine one here, right? So whether or not you find cool slush geysers on your map is going to be a wild swing in your sort of cooling fortunes. It's going to make a big difference for a lot of your bases. Next up, we have the electrolyzer, but this time steel. You might be thinking, well, we already heated the water up to 95 degrees in the previous electrolyzer cooling thing that you explained. What's going on here? Well, the answer is you can feed steam effectively into an electrolyzer. If you use the liquid pipe mechanics of throttling the flow down to 1 kilogram per second, the game will let you feed water at a higher temperature into an electrolyzer. Maybe this is a little bit exploity. I mean, maybe obviously this is a little bit exploity and this is a little bit exploity. A lot of these things could be argued as a little bit of an exploit. But we've talked about this in previous builds, these pipe mechanics. If you use these pipe mechanics to input instead of 95 degree water, but instead input water at 250 degrees, using the pipe mechanics, which I can go to. Again, this is another subject for a later video if people are interested, right? The rock granulator build is a subject for future videos. The ice maker I've already done a video on. The Pacus I could do a video on. If there's real demand for any one of these cooling solutions, let me know in the comments and I can make a build really easy for a lot of these things. But I think I'm going to make a build for this one regardless, because this is just going to be so fundamental to a lot of stuff going forward. The electrolyzer, if you put in 250 degree water and then cooled, assuming the water started at 70 degrees and you cooled the outputs down to 70 degrees as well, you would get around 544,000 DTUs per second of cooling, which amounts to around 7,810 kilograms of water you could cool down by 10 degrees every cycle. So the electrolyzer, once you have steel components and set up the build correctly, should be able to provide a lot of cooling for your base. Just a single electrolyzer with the setup. There's going to be a lot of power requirements for this because you're going to need to heat and cool stuff. I can show you a build that will be very efficient with that power and not generate a ton of heat with your power options. But even so, we have way up here the coal generator at 9,000 DTUs per second. This electrolyzer, can basically remove 544,000 DTUs per second. You could be running a lot of coal generators and still this thing would be a net gain in terms of cooling. So steel component electrolyzer builds also going to be a great option. Of course, we have the old option of the big three, along with the carbon skimmers and the water sieves, and that is the steam turbine. A steam turbine operating at maximum capacity will delete exactly 877,590 DTUs per second, or basically 12,600 kilograms of water you could reduce by 10 degrees Celsius every cycle, is what you can get out of the steam turbine. This is going to be the go-to for a lot of players still. It's very powerful. They're very familiar with it. Basically, you're going to have some sort of heat generation solution down here, which is going to provide cooling to the rest of your base, right? It's going to be either thermal aquatuners or thermal regulators. The way things are set up, 2 steam turbines can delete the heat that is moved by exactly 3 thermal aquatuners. It's actually exactly that. It's 3 thermal aquatuners generate enough heat to keep 2 steam turbines running at full capacity the entire time. So obviously this is not a power positive system because these steam turbines are only going to generate 850 watts apiece, and you're only going to have 2 of them. Meanwhile, your aquatuners are going to be, your aquatuners are going to be costing you 1,200 watts a piece. So not a power positive system. You'll need to dump more power in there. But again, a lot of cooling getting done with this. A lot of power here with the cooling option of the steam turbine. And I think you're going to see a lot of this along with electrolyzers. Next up, we have petroleum generators. And I do expect this to be nerfed. There are kind of 2 reasons why I held off on producing this video. The first was that I expected an announcement on the petroleum generator and natural gas generator. Natural gas generator, not one of the options I'm looking over today, but it will function very similarly. Because they were removing these fixed output temperatures, I also kind of had an expectation that they would change the output temperatures of the petroleum generator to match the input temperatures of the petroleum, particularly because the specific heat capacity of the petroleum coming in has roughly the same specific heat capacity of the outputs of carbon dioxide and polluted water. But right, for now, the outputs of the petroleum generator are set at the temperature of the petroleum generator. So if you cool down this petroleum generator, if you kept this in an ultra cold room of negative 200 degrees Celsius and used steel components to feed in 250 degree petroleum into the petroleum generator, right, you can get a massive amount of cooling out of the system. This is 1,416,000 DTUs per second that you're able to get rid of using the petroleum generator, an absolutely massive amount of heat deletion using the output temperatures of the petroleum generator, which are not fixed again, but are set to the temperature of the petroleum generator rather than the temperature of the inputs. So for now at least, and I do expect this to be changed, don't build your base off the back of this yet, because I do think this is going to be what happens next, and the next patch is that they're going to nerf this behavior. But your petroleum generator will cool down an absolutely massive amount of water, right? Here we have, what is this? This is 200,335 kilograms of water that you can cool down by 10 degrees every cycle just using one of these steel component petroleum generator builds. Likewise, we have the same thing but with thermium. Thermium would allow us to handle the hot petroleum. So assuming the petroleum comes in at a temperature of 500 degrees Celsius now as opposed to 250 degrees Celsius, we get this massive amount of water that's cooled down. This is 2,296,381 DTUs per second, or the equivalent of 32,970 kilograms of water that you can cool down by 10 degrees every cycle. And then we have the granddaddy of them all, one that I don't expect to be nerfed, or at least they're going to have to do a lot of work to nerf it, and that is thermium electrolyzers. If you heat up the water going into an electrolyzer by 880 degrees Celsius and use that to cool down, that process of heating up that water to cool down the outputs of your electrolyzer, right? that difference in specific heat capacity from the incoming water to the outgoing oxygen and hydrogen is going to net you 2,659,536 DTUs per second. It's going to be able to cool off almost an entirely packed thing of water here. This is 38,184 kilograms of water that you're going to be able to reduce by 10 degrees Celsius every cycle using this build. So, from all the way down here, thermium electrolyzers, absolutely massive. I'm going to make a video at some point detailing what a build like this would look like. It's pretty simple. It only really has 5 components, and a lot of them are going to be very familiar, like a pool of water, an output area for your gases, an electrolyzer room, right? A lot of it's going to be pretty basic. I'm going to make a video on this. But we still have a lot of heat removal options, ranging in power all the way from the lowly Pacu and carbon dioxide geysers down to cool steam vents, which I think were right here, not cool steam vents, cool slush geysers, all the way down to thermium electrolyzer setups with heat exchangers and heat dumping areas and all this stuff. I'm going to make a video. It's going to look cool. But we still have a lot of options for getting rid of our heat in this game. They just need to require us to think a little bit outside of the box. I don't think that we are reduced solely to Wheezeworts, ice makers, and steam turbines. I think there's a lot more options, a lot more things that we could do. These options get more powerful as you go into space and gain access to thermium components. And I think that it's going to make this game really interesting going forward. In particular, I think given the introduction of new biomes and the heat challenges that these biomes face, like Oasis and Iridio and to some extent Vulcanea, although Vulcanea is a little bit hit and miss because sometimes all the volcano areas are enclosed entirely in abyssalites, so you never actually have a heat problem. I don't know. I mean, I actually think like consistently Oasis is going to be a harder map to play than Vulcanea because of that, but Vulcanea could have, just exposure. Your starting base could basically be exposed to magma, so there's some issues there. Anyways, especially given the new difficulty settings that they have for the game, I think that there's going to be a lot of really creative, really interesting heat management options that get explored, and I think this is a pretty good overview of a lot of the different options that you have and the relative power of all of these options. So yeah, hope this is helpful. Again, specific videos to come, definitely on electrolyzer setups and how you can manage that. Probably not on the Petroleum Generator because I expect this to be nerfed. Steam Turbine setups are going to be bread and butter. I'm probably going to make a video on those. The rock granulator, probably going to be the subject of a video. And maybe, I've already done the ice maker and that video still applies, but maybe as well the Pacu are going to be something that I do a video on. So a lot of cool stuff to come. Stay tuned to the channel, and I think that's it for this episode. We've already gone pretty long at 33 minutes, but I think this is a lot of the really interesting stuff in the game going on right now. Heat management is going to be a massive thing going forward now that they've nerfed these buildings, and yeah, a lot of options to explore. All right, I'm going to cut things here, and I'll catch you guys next time.